I'm joined by the philosopher Roger Scruton and the writer Will Self to debate the state of modern culture in the 20th century. Is contemporary culture evidence of a moral and aesthetic decline in our civilization this century, or does it show a society richer and more diverse than it's ever been? Will Self is a writer whose ability to provoke, whether through his use of language or his drug-taking past, has led him to being linked with the shock tactics of young Brits like his friend Damien Hirst. His novels and short story collections like his latest, Tough, Tough Toys for Tough, Tough Boys, are darkly realistic and sometimes horrific, dealing with the underbelly of modern culture. The philosopher Roger Scruton is also no stranger to controversy. Heralded by some as the brightest intellect of his time, cruelly described by others as the unthinking man's thinker, his work has often been overshadowed by his self-confessed right-wing politics. Formerly professor at Birkbeck College, London, and the University of Boston, he's written over 20 books on subjects ranging from architecture and aesthetics to sexual desire and fox hunting. His latest book is An Intelligent Person's Guide to Modern Culture, and he prefaces it by saying, quote, "You don't have to be familiar with the entire canon of Western literature and full range of artistic masterpieces, but you should have some familiarity with T.S. Eliot, Baudelaire, Mozart, Wagner, Monet, Poussin, Tennyson, Schoenberg, George Herbert, Goethe, Nietsche, and Marx." Well, doesn't that seem to you, Roger Scruton, as rather an exclusive European great white dead male list?
Well, I am talking about modern culture, which was created by dead white males on the whole, so I suppose it's inevitable. Had I begun the book saying that I presume some familiarity with Confucius and Lao Tse and such characters, then I think I would have had a completely different readership and certainly wouldn't have sold anything over here.
But if you're talking about modern culture, some slight genuflection to that period of modernity known as the 20th century might have been in order. What about films, for instance?
Yes, I'm aware that I'm not really as articulate about films as I ought to be. I haven't had the time required in the cinema to be able to speak with authority about them.
Can I butt in here and say it is quite important at the opening of the book, Roger, this list is not presented as simply an analogue of any possible range of cultural sources that we might have in order to read The Intelligent Person's Guide. It seems to be more or less essential, in your view. That's the only way I can take it. The only alternative is that it's some sort of display of your own erudition, a sort of, reminded me rather of the scene in the Rachel papers where the character leaves books open for his girlfriend so that she can see the spines of what he's putatively reading. Because it is a very precise list, and I think that any cultured person could quite easily sit down and write down an analogue list that would serve just as well to express
No, I
the
agree
idea.
with that. Somebody could produce a completely different list. I only put those names down because those are the people I talk about. I talk about a particular current of self-definition in modern culture, if you like, which I think begins with Baudelaire and Wagner and comes to fruition in T.S. Eliot. So it would be very difficult for me to talk about that to people who hadn't any familiarity with those particular
I'm
artists.
not criticising the quality of your list, it goes without saying, nor the fact that in many ways your list forms part of that which I admire and myself have fed on. I just think that when you talk of the list in terms of modern culture, you're talking about a sliver of modern culture, and your book deliberately sets itself against a great deal of what modern culture is. So maybe you define culture in a completely different way from the rest of us.
I also think it rather jibes against what you say is your method, which you describe as being archaeological. I mean, for a start, you're now saying that the question the list is, as it were, justified ex post facto by the use of them in the text. But you also say at the outset that you're going to perform an archaeological investigation of the culture, which suggests to me a very careful removal of strata with a kind of psychic teaspoon. And this is not really what you're doing, is it? Because the book is, in fact, highly anecdotal and discursive in a way.
Well, this is arguable. One of my purposes is to distinguish three concepts of culture, one being that which the anthropologists use to denote the force of cohesion which keeps a community together, which I call common culture. Another being that which the literary critics refer to as culture, which I call high culture. That is to say, the exploration of the human spirit in its more pugnacious and refined variety, varieties. And then there is this other thing, which you're talking about really, popular culture, which is available to anyone regardless of his state of education, regardless of intelligence, regardless even of engagement, level of engagement with others. And, of course, on that third level, just about anything could be included and talked about. And certainly you wouldn't have a book of 120 pages, which is what I was commissioned to write.
You mean it would be much longer?
Much longer and also much less interesting.
Well, that's your opinion. A lot of people think that books about the culture which has grown more emphatic in the 20th century could be just as interesting.
Yes, maybe they could. I haven't come across any that are.
I mean, in one area where, I mean, you can argue this as a sort of reductio ad absurdum, that it's not necessary for you to examine the great panoply of popular culture because you merely wish to dismiss it. Yet within the book, there is in fact the unusual spectacle of Roger Scruton doing line-by-line analyses of the lyrics of Nirvana and Oasis. So, you know, you've made quite a partial selection of this popular culture which you wish to dismiss, and you do discuss it in some depth, rather leaving yourself open to the charge of not covering it at all adequately and covering it partially and prejudicially.
Well, yeah, this charge is bound to be made as soon as people make judgments in the modern world, they're dismissed as judgmental. Now, I don't mind being called judgmental.
Oh, I didn't say that.
I know, but I do make distinctions between those things which are worth attending to, those things which are not. But I also have another theme in this book, which is a kind of anthropological theme. I trace culture in its anthropological sense to the idea of membership, you know, and the rites of passage which make membership available to the newborn in the community and make the transition from youth to adulthood possible. And I'm very interested in, especially modern pop music, because I want to try and diagnose what is strange about this particular culture. I think it does offer a form of membership, but it's membership without that rite of passage into the adult world.
What I'm trying to establish is that there's stuff in popular culture which is qualities which you entirely dismiss because you think popular culture itself is dismissible.
No,
I think that's a pity.
Yes, I don't think that. I think that there are many parts of modern popular culture which are entirely degenerate. I don't think that, therefore, all of it is. And it is certainly true that bits of the intellectual life creep into radio and television, as in this programme, which presumably ought to be worth listening to.
Well, we hope we're worth listening to. I would say that, of course, you're not trying to utterly dismiss popular culture. I think you've got a problem, which is that there is no rigid distinction between high culture and popular culture, and particularly in the period we're living through. I think what you're trying to establish here is a cultural assay and to, you know, stake a claim to the virtues of high culture above those of popular culture. But the whole problem for me is that this is a cultural critique that is in a rear-view mirror. This is a mind looking in a rear-view mirror and analysing what's behind the road. Well, and the other thing, just while I have the mic, is that your analysis of popular culture and pop music in Britain seems to me very, very much concerned, Pache, Nirvana and Oasis, with the white male guitar band. Now, you know, one of the most exciting developments in popular music in this country in the last 20 or 30 years has been the absorption of the Afro-Caribbean community into the fold of popular culture. And indeed, I'd argue that popular culture would be utterly exhausted without the kind of multiculturalism that we have at the moment. And this is not something that is prescriptive. You have a marvellous phrase in this where you say that a multicultural education can never teach true religion. Well, it may not be able to teach true religion, but it certainly can teach good rhythm and melody, which are things that you would argue are devoid from popular music. On the contrary, I think there are some popular beat combos at the moment who are doing truly exciting things with this music. And this is from somebody who spends most of his time closeted with the OED. So I don't think it's I think it's quite possible for people to be passionate about popular culture and passionate about high culture, know where the difference between them lies, but it's a ragged fault line, and also presumably have the nous not to believe that, like some economist, you can take an essay of the whole culture at any one point and say anything meaningful about it. Surely culture is a praxis.
Well, you've just said something meaningful about it, and I wouldn't disagree with you that the line that divides high culture from popular culture is a ragged one, and one which, of course, has a no man's land, which is constantly being crossed by spectres.
Wouldn't it be better to look at this, instead of looking at it as high and low, and there's exclusive and inclusive, and there's elitist and non-elitist. Wouldn't it be better to look at this as good or bad? Why do you want it to be a club?
Because I'm talking about...
Which excludes, whose primary purpose is to exclude, like all clubs.
No, its primary purpose, like all clubs, is to include and elevate, which you can only do by excluding.
Depends, half bottles, half full, half empty.
No, but you should... my book is trying to develop an argument about what culture is, and I'm trying to explain it through the concept of membership. And, all human beings, in my view, require membership. The tribal forms of membership, which the anthropologists explored so illuminatingly, are no longer available to us. The religious life is no longer widely available, although the yearning for it is there in all modern people still. But there are other things that are offered which offer different kinds of membership. My distinction between the high and the popular in culture is that there are forms of membership which require education, expertise, critical analysis.
Nobody disagrees that that's part of some parts of culture, but not necessarily part of all parts of culture.
No, exactly.
I mean, inside Bartók are folk songs which actually make Bartók's music great, and were presumably sung and uttered by people who perhaps never even learned to read and write, never mind had a big education and so on. But can I go to religion now, because you are very impressed by that, and you make it an important part of your thinking, and you talk about that the central idea of a common culture is religious, and it stems from that. You have an idea of the sacred in culture, very similar to that of David Jones, the novelist and poet. So can you develop why the idea of religion is still so central to culture in your view, even though you yourself, as I take it, aren't wholly religious? But let's come to that in a second.
That's not so. But what it's... Yeah, the point... I talk about religion because, in my view, the great enterprise of human social life is to retain the image of human beings as somehow elevated above nature. And the common culture of a tribe presents this image in its own way, and I call it the image of the ethical life in which we're held to account before each other. Religion is obviously the easiest way of doing this. It presents us with a sense of being accountable before the divine or the supernatural, and fills the world with the experience of the sacred, of the untouchable, and all these...
But isn't religion rather like pop culture, that anybody can take part despite their education?
This is why it's of interest to me, why I called it part of common culture. It's precisely that about it which makes it the unifying force in society.
Can I ask you a rather left field question? Have you ever experienced an oral hallucination?
Yes, I think so. Why is this relevant?
Well, because I think the opening sections of your book and the way in which you trace culture from the religious experience at the tribal level put me very much in mind of Julian Jaynes' seminal work, The Origin of Consciousness and the Breakdown of the Bicameral Mind. Indeed, it struck me almost as an inversion of Jaynes' thesis, which is that reflective self-consciousness came very, very late to humans. I mean, he puts it somewhere between the Odyssey and the Iliad. He sees the Odyssey as pre-conscious and the Iliad as post-conscious. I don't want to get into his theories generally, but one thing that struck me about your argument is that you sort of subscribe to the Jaynesian view of religion, the disembodied voice of God, as telling people what their identity is and telling them what to do. Now, Jaynes would have said that this was a literal voice in the mind, and there's an interesting correlation between people who are religiously inclined and who have experienced voices in the mind telling them what to do. So it's not a trivial or a off-beam question. I take these points quite seriously, but I see your attempt to found culture on essentially pre-conscious grounds as quite inimical to the whole project of the Enlightenment, which you seem distinctly equivocal about anyway.
Well, this is all massively interesting what you're saying, but I don't know whether I agree with any of it. The kind of religion I'm talking about is that which consists in simply doing the done thing, dancing the right dances, attending the right rituals, and so on, and through that rehearsing one's identity with the community surrounding one.
You could say going out on Saturday night in Birmingham to a disco satisfies that.
That's why I take up the theme of youth culture later, because
you
I
don't
agree that it does have some of
take
that.
seriously the idea. I mean, you mentioned quite controversially at the end of your book that there can be no account of of the effect, any coherent account of youth culture which does not give a central place to drugs. But then you seem to completely fail to analyse drugs or give any. I mean, could it not be that drugs are the rite of passage that you're seeking?
No,
certainly a lot of young people view it that way.
I argue that the opposite of that. I argue that their charm consists precisely in the fact that they make of youth itself into a dead end.
Yeah, but I mean, this is in line with your division between fantasy and imagination, isn't it? I mean, you seem to have quite a number of rather, I would say, for a philosopher, rather crude dialectics running behind your analysis of things like drugs. It seems to be the impact of drugs and the synergy with popular culture is manifold, complex, cannot be reduced to a couple of syllogisms.
Well, it certainly it's a book in itself, if that's what you mean. But if you,
I mean, I just don't think you can make this statement: any coherent account of youth culture which does not give a central place to drugs, and then fail to substantiate it. I mean, it's a bit sort of.
Well, your books as an example, surely illustrate what I mean. The central place of drugs in the youth culture that you describe, is manifest, isn't it? And it's true also of, I'd say, Irving Welsh.
Yes, I would be interested to know whether you've read Trainspotting.
Yes.
You have read it through?
Yeah.
Now, would you consider that an example of popular culture or high culture?
It's got a huge following, and it's a kind of membership-defining book. And certainly not, I mean, it's so badly written, I think, that I wouldn't call it it's an unsuccessful attempt, if you like, of elevating to the level of high culture.
And presumably your statement is extremely badly written, can stand sui generis, because you are the critic in that way.
No, I'd have to argue that, but not on this programme. But I think if you just compare his Scotifying dialogue with Sir Walter himself, you'll just see how second-rate it is.
But it's not Scotified dialogue, it's an attempt to transliterate a demotic.
Yeah, but
which is a different thing altogether.
Just a few minutes ago, I slightly deflected you from a defence you're putting up for religion as being the basis and the thatch of culture. Can you develop that just a touch more?
Yes, what I would want to say about it is that all forms of membership, in the end, involve submission to the collective identity, to a recognition that you are not alone and don't have the absolute right to define yourself for yourself. This is a hard thing for people to bear, but it's also something that people want. And religion is the easy and peaceful way of going about this. You, as it were, join in the collective submission to a supernatural authority, higher than, not only than me, but higher than you too. And you rejoice in the fact that you're in your common obedience, which takes away all the obvious sources of conflict between you.
I would imagine, given your views on that, you must have manifold reasons for feeling depressed in the contemporary culture, because, say, you take the established church as a possible repository of this arena of imagining and of essentially spiritual imagining, it must depress you no end. I mean, the emasculation of the liturgy, something that you hold to be extremely important.
It does depress me. I mean, obviously I'm talking about something, as you say, it's a rear mirror view, because I'm talking about something which is vanishing, and I admit that it is vanishing, but it's no reason why one shouldn't try to understand it and understand what was valuable in it.
Can I just throw in towards, as we're coming to the ends of this, one more thing? You miss out, talking about modern culture, you amid cinema, you have no time for television and radio. Newspapers and magazines don't come into modern culture. A lot of people would think that all those things are a huge part of modern culture, for better and for worse. But there's no mention of science. And I'd have thought today science is a massive part of modern culture. Why is that?
I do try to uphold the thesis which is associated sometimes with people like Leavis, that science is, of its nature, not part of culture. It deals with another kind of knowledge, theoretical as opposed to practical. That's the distinction is obviously an old one, but I think
Is it valid today?
I think it is.
Really?
Of course, I was brought up. I had a scientific education and was quite familiar with that way of thinking, and it was, I suppose, my sense of its incompleteness which drove me in a philosophical direction. And I would like to think that I make a case here and there in the book, although it isn't the central theme, for the view that scientific knowledge, however valuable it is and indispensable to us, is not of itself on the same level as the kind of knowledge that's contained in any kind of culture, either popular or
You make a very, very emphatic point, which is that science is a mode of looking at the world which cannot explain any of the whatness of the world, of what it's as it were out of court. But I, again, find this, as with your views on popular culture, to be a etiolated, desiccated, essentially moribund sort of distinction.
But you find etiolated, desiccated, moribund things everywhere you look. I myself don't live in that way.
Well, on the contrary, I'd say that the whiff that comes off this work is one of misanthropy. I was reminded on every page of Schopenhauer's dictum, the more I love mankind, the less I love men. And it seems to me that that's very much your perspective.
Obviously this distinguishes it entirely from your novels and stories, in which love of the human species is the primary
novels and stories are non-prescriptive in this sense. I mean, I kept thinking, who is this book aimed at?
But you choose to describe only unlovable things.
Well, I don't view that. And again, as I say, I'm not writing prescriptively. As you say yourself, the job of novelist to present states of mind, which I would agree with. You, on the other hand, are writing a critical work of philosophy.
I'm writing an argument which is trying to understand the phenomenon.
Can I come back briefly to this modern culture notion and the way that you have elegantly tiptoed around it? But actually, to all intents and purposes, you do exclude science, and yet a lot of writers, a lot of thinkers, a lot of people now get the pleasures from science, which pleasures of stretching their imagination, tingling their intellect, setting them off excited in different directions, extending their knowledge. Are you saying that this is outside what you get from reading a good book?
No, I mean...
A good novel,
well, it's a different kind of pleasure.
But is it not part of modern culture? Can you just tell us why? I mean, you're a very, very clever man. You're bound to have thought this through. I've given up on you about cinema and television, radio. But what about science?
Because I would say this, that scientific knowledge is not a form, doesn't offer a form of social membership.
What do you mean by that, and why doesn't it?
It doesn't put you in automatic relation with people with whom you say, to this I belong, and this is part of me.
Yes, it does. All sorts of... I mean, I started to read about, I started to read about genetics over the last 5 or 6 years, and people I meet who, like myself, have started late and started to read about it. I'm as much in contact with them as I am with people I know who like, as I do, Will Self's books. I mean, it's a similar sort of club.
I'd say a comparable phenomenon, and I'd agree with Melvyn on this, is, say, the rise of writing on artificial intelligence and on consciousness itself, which is very definitely a cultural phenomenon, and the meeting of minds about
There's
minds
a cultural phenomenon which is interested in this, but it itself is not... a part of culture in the way that, say, the novels of Dickens are. In entering the world of Dickens, you are actually schooling your own emotions and putting them into line with an imaginative world to which you are, while reading, belonging, and which you take away with you. In the case of scientific knowledge, however valuable it is, however interesting, it isn't interesting because of the community that is being, as it were, limbed and intimated through it. A community may arise out of it, like the community of computer nerds, if you can call it that.
Fair enough, but I mean, why is it? You see, at the beginning of this book, I thought you were going to have to write something pretty solidly about national culture in this sense, because you go back to culture, you go back to Herder, you go back to culture defined within the tribal context, and then you flirt with the notion of discussing national culture. And elsewhere in your oeuvre, you've made statements on this, but there's nothing actually in this book. I mean, you want to stand out against sort of mishy-mashy cultural relativism, but there's nowhere that says, Britain's best, which I was expecting.
I don't think that. I much prefer French culture, if the truth were known.
Except that you attack French culture in terms of attacking the French philosophers and their deconstruction.
Well,
you attack them very hard indeed.
What I attack is its own repudiation of itself in 1968 and thereafter.
But I mean, if you could ride to hounds in France, would you move over? I'm not being flip, because this is important for you.
You can, and I will, probably.
But you do think that the deconstructionist philosophers are doing the devil's work, don't you?
Well, I use that metaphor in order to understand what it is that's animating them. That they're moved by animus against the European culture, which has been predominant since the Enlightenment, which is the thing that I am really defending as our high culture, because it's our intellectual tradition. And
there's a great deal of what you say with which I agree, but what seems to me to be... the omissions, I think, are unforgivable. But there's another thing that worries me, and is that you always reach back for examples. countering Will earlier, you reach back to Dickens, which is fine and true. We all love Charles Dickens. Me talking about science, you reach... I do, and Roger does. You reach back, and so that's 2 out of 3, a majority holds here. And you keep... the past is always not only honoured above the present, which is fair enough, because you're Confucian in that sense, but also used as a mallet to knock the little pegs of the present below ground.
I'm not sure that I agree with that. Again, I'm not trying to seal off the possibility of the re-emergence of these great currents of thought and feeling which I'm describing, but I am taking examples which are of interest to me. In particular, the book is, I suppose, primarily about TS Eliot and modernism and the enterprise that represents, and I think of that as pointing to the past only in order to rescue it for the present. It's not a kind of museum approach.
Again, it's your harsh cut-offs on these things that make your thesis difficult to cope with. I mean, I think I accept in some ways you seem to be pushing towards the idea, which I certainly would endorse, that there's a diplopia between Romanticism and modernism, that the two movements exist in connection with one another. It seems to me you're far too keen to curtail modernism quite early on, and it seems to me that things like what you describe as, I can't remember your term for it, kitsch, avant-garde and kitsch, or post-modernism, these seem to me highly epiphenomenal, and indeed it seems to me, and it's a shame that you didn't examine film as an aspect of popular culture, because it seems to me that film, particularly in the post-war period, particularly in the 70s and early 80s, was an enormous gasp of romanticism, of high romanticism, and that high romanticism, or as it were, romento-modernism, is still highly imminent in our culture.
I'm sure you're right that I should have looked at film as well. I would have had to have 2 of my lives to know as much about film as I know about music. And why talk in a second-rate way about something you only half know about?
I wish you'd acknowledged it rather than dismiss it. If you know nothing about it, I think it's fair enough to say, I know nothing, but there it is, instead of I know nothing and so I'm going to boot it out and say it's dreadful.
Well, I just don't mention it. Surely that's right.
Quite an omission when you talk about
modern cookery or baby clothes, all kinds of things which interest me enormously.
I can't think of a better note on which to end the programme than you being interested in baby clothes, Roger. And that's Roger Scruton, who's Intelligent Person's Guide to Modern Culture and Art, and Will Self, who is scribbling Mr. Self, and I hope we see another book soon.
You will.
Thanks for listening.